This is Professor Upfer, and today we'll be talking about mental disorders. The lecture will be divided into 3 parts. The first part will cover concepts and diagnostics. The second part will cover anxiety disorders, and the third part will cover depression. So, as an orientation to mental disorders, I want to start with an old-time riddle. This comes from a radio show back in the 1920s called Cecil and Sally. It goes something like this. So Cecil says, "Did I tell you I'm a whiz at inventing riddles?" And Sally says, "I don't know, Cecil. Only people really smart can invent riddles." Cecil says, "Nothing doing. Anybody can invent a riddle." So he proceeds to tell the riddle. It goes like this. A tall, well-dressed man follows a woman and steals her scarf. He then goes to a restaurant, scarf in hand, and orders a sandwich and a cup of coffee. But he departs before the sandwich is brought to him. He stops at a traffic light and throws the stolen scarf into a dilapidated car driven by 2 disreputable characters. He runs away. When the clock strikes 2, he walks into the best jewelry store in the neighborhood and asks for another sandwich and a cup of coffee. Why did the man do all this? Sally says, "I don't know. I give up." Cecil says, "Because the man was crazy." Now, this is a horrible riddle. I mean, apparently, Cecil is on the impression that to tell a riddle, you just need to come up with a whole bunch of completely random, disconnected things. Sally is on a different principle. All right. So Cecil seemed to think that the man was crazy is just a synonym with the man was behaving randomly. In contrast, Sally was thinking like a good psychologist. Unusual behavior on her thinking could be understood using the same concepts that we use to understand ordinary behavior. In this view, crazy behavior is not random or unintelligible. Now, this suggests a certain principle. Sort of a thesis, an overarching idea for understanding mental disorders. And that is to understand human behavior, even so-called crazy behavior, you have to think like Sally and not like Cecil. We can call this the Sally principle. The explanations that psychologists offer for abnormal behavior do not differ from their explanations for normal behavior. Put another way, the symptoms of many, maybe most, mental disorders are not qualitatively different from the experiences that most of us have had. They differ only in degree. That's a thesis that I want to test by looking more closely at how we diagnose what mental disorders are, as well as looking more closely at 2 of the most prevalent mental disorders in the United States, anxiety disorders, and depression. So first off, what are mental disorders? Mental disorders are a set of problems. Now, you can have any number of set of problems, but mental disorders are sets of problems that have an internal source. Maybe you are staying up all night because you're worried. That has an internal source. If you're staying up all night because your neighbors are noisy, that has an external source. A mental disorder is also not directly voluntary. You might choose to stay up all night. That would be directly voluntary. But if you're staying up all night because you're worried, well, you're not directly choosing to be worried, not directly. And so in that case, staying up all night due to worry would be not directly voluntary. And the last requirement is very important. It has to involve clinically significant detriment. Clinically significant detriment. A clinically significant detriment involves distress, impairment or both distress and impairment. So, for example, if you're staying up all night due to worry and you don't want to stay up all night due to worry, that would be that you are distressed about your insomnia. And if it's affecting your ability to do your work at school, all right, that would also be an impairment. It also has to be clinically significant. That's an important concept. A clinically significant problem is one that significantly interferes with the patient's work and love life. Those are the two major criteria. If something interferes with your work and it interferes with your romance, then it's probably interfering with a substantial part of your long-term well-being. Now, there are all kinds of problems with potential for clinical significance. Sleeplessness, as in my example, has potential for clinical significance. Forgetting, difficulty concentrating, a fear of other people, sadness, thoughts of suicide, and so on. But those, although they have a potential for clinical significance, they aren't necessarily clinically significant. In fact, most of us have been sleepless sometimes, or forgotten things sometimes, or sometimes had difficulty concentrating. In fact, many people have had thoughts of suicide, but they were just fleeting thoughts. Good example is if you stand at the edge of a cliff or a tall place and look down, you might think, what would happen if I jumped? Now, that again isn't a clinically significant thought of suicide, it's just thinking. So these individual problems, these individual problems are what we might call a symptom. It's a characteristic of a person's actions, thoughts, or feelings that could be a potential indicator of a mental disorder. Not just failing to sleep, that wouldn't be one time a symptom, but daily sleeplessness, or a daily inability to concentrate, or a recurring involuntary thought of suicide. Those might be symptoms. And what a syndrome is it's a constellation of interrelated symptoms manifested by an individual. So if you both can't sleep daily, you daily have an inability to concentrate, and you have a recurring thought of suicide, and those three things together are preventing you from doing your work and interfering with your love life, then we might be looking at a mental disorder. Now, the process of diagnosing mental disorders is made with reference to a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. The DSM has been through multiple revisions. I'm showing you here the DSM-4, meaning the fourth edition, TR, so it's another revision to the 4, and it listed about 300 mental disorders. Each of these have detailed diagnostic criteria, information about the prevalence of the disorder and a prognosis, and the purpose of the DSM-4 is to suggest a potential source of treatment. Now, the DSM-4, as you might guess, started long before the 4. So before 1952, originally, before any of the diagnostic and statistical manuals, all psychologists had were two big categories, psychosis and neurosis. Psychosis was said to involve a break with reality, whereas a neurosis, a patient was still in contact with reality, but still suffered from other mental disorders. Beginning with the DSM-1 in 1952, and then continuing on to the DSM-2 in 1968, the psychosis and neurosis categories began to be differentiated. But at this point, diagnoses were still largely influenced by the psychoanalytic theory and framework of Freud. Another thing that was important about these is that if you were diagnosed with one of these mental disorders, according to the DSM-1 and the DSM-2, and you were seen by another doctor, and they were asked to say what kind of mental disorder you had, the reliability of any one of these diagnoses was scarcely better than expected by chance. And so this led to a very large, important revision of the diagnostic criteria for mental disorders. And the first large-scale, much more statistically rigorous manual came about in the DSM-3. The DSM-3 was published in 1980. It was a watershed event in the history and practice of clinical psychology. The way that it was developed went like this. So subjects who were suspected of having a disorder were then independently diagnosed by a number of clinicians, each one using a different diagnostic system. And then the systems that produced the greatest reliability were retained. I should say that this method is very much the way that machine learning works for figuring out what kind of movies you might like. So Netflix, for example, would have competitive systems for predicting who's going to like what, and the ones that are the most reliable and the ones with the greatest predictive validity were the ones that were retained. As a result, the categories of psychosis and neurosis were found to be not useful, and so they were dropped. And the resulting diagnostic reliability of the DSM-3 was observed to be about as high as that of diagnosing physical disorders. For example, if you break your arm and you go into a doctor, it's not always 100% clear whether you have a broken arm versus, say, a hairline fracture. There will be borderline cases. And there are borderline cases in mental disorders too. But there are also very clear-cut cases, and the overall diagnostic reliability is about the same as diagnosing something like a broken arm. In addition, the validity of the diagnoses were improved through extensive research, and these changes were incorporated in subsequent editions, the DSM-3R and the DSM-4. What I'm showing you in this slide is an example of the kind of axes over which a clinician might make a diagnosis of a mental disorder. There are 5 axes. The first one tells us what kind of disorder a person might have. In the example that I'm giving, it's a major depressive disorder. The major depressive disorder is made as a diagnosis because at least 5 of the following symptoms had been present during the same 2-week period and represented a change from previous functioning. For example, a depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. Markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities, most of the day, nearly every day, and so on. Right? Then in the second axis, axis 2, any personality disorders that might be comorbid or that might co-occur with the primary mental disorder is indicated. Then in axis 3, something having to do with the patient's biological health, for example, having diabetes. In axis 4, they talk about any potential problems related to the social environment. In this case, the person had her wedding, she was engaged, and the engagement was terminated. And then in axis 5 is a general rating on a 100-point scale about how well or the person is doing. So this person got a 55, indicating moderate difficulty in social, occupational, or school functioning. Now, the idea that I want to get across is that the explanations for psychologists offer for abnormal behavior, don't differ from their explanations for normal behavior. So all of these individual symptoms, all right, they're not just sort of explained away by us saying, oh, the person has daily sleeplessness because the person is depressed. We also want to know, well, what is exactly it is that's keeping them up all night? Are they worried about something? Well, if so, what are they worried about? And so on. In the next lecture, we'll take a closer look at the application of this idea to anxiety disorders and then to depression.